Good afternoon. Welcome to IISS. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nigel Inkster. I'm Senior Advisor here at the Institute, and it's my great pleasure to chair this session with John Mallory, a colleague and I'd like to think friend of some long-standing. Between us, we've done quite a number of engagements dealing with Russia and China on military uses of cyber and on cybersecurity more generally. John has been for many years at MIT, has been involved in information communications technology pretty much from the get-go, but also combines this knowledge with a deep understanding of geopolitics and geostrategy, which is extremely helpful in this context. He's going to talk about cyber arms control, a much used and little understood concept. And since he knows a lot more about it than me, I'm going to turn the floor straight over to him.
Thanks very much, Nigel. It's great to be here again and doing a little drive-by. This particular talk is going to combine several items that we've spoken about with the Chinese, the Russians, on the insecurity dilemmas, and then on the topic of international vulnerabilities equity process in Korea, and then with the Chinese. The Russians didn't get visas, so we don't know yet. And so I'm going to give you my view on cyber arms control. It's not really sit down and negotiate with the other guy and then verify and so forth, because it's completely impractical in this space. Because first of all, it's hard to say what a cyber weapon is. Cyber weapon is a set of vulnerabilities that can be exploited, but they're really exploited by an organization with a set of tools, techniques, and procedures and people. And moreover, to borrow a term from the nuclear realm, it's a covert capability. So its effectiveness depends on it being a secret to the victim. Otherwise, it can be fairly easy to block. So with that, I'll get going. We're going to look at 7 regional cyber insecurity dilemmas as a motivator for why we need to engage in this activity. We'll look at 3 modes of cyber risk reduction, responding to those insecurity dilemmas, and then 5 norms to implement cyber arms control. They primarily focus on capability, not on restricting the specific targets of espionage or attack. And that's a whole other area that actually drives the insecurity dilemmas. And then we'll talk through, really focus mostly on international vulnerabilities equity process here. So we have a situation today where cyber insecurity dilemmas are proliferating, and probably regular insecurity dilemmas are a problem given the military modernizations underway in Russia, China, and the U.S. now at this point. So countries are reacting to the preparation of the battlefield, asymmetric warfare that might degrade military systems, mining of critical infrastructure as a strategic capability, but mostly they're looking at exploitation of political military targets, influence operations, so on, and industrial targets, so to economic espionage. And so that's where a lot of capability is applied. Offense dominance means the best defense is more offense. The structure ends up being a prisoner's dilemma. Cooperative solutions can help moderate these. But the offense dominance makes the military postures unstable, and in various ways. And we've been doing a dialogue with mostly with China, but a little bit with Russia on military cyber stability. And the problem is to identify mechanisms of instability, and then to come up with ways to manage those so that you don't have accidental wars, you don't have momentum-driven conflicts where it's a use it or lose it in the beginning, or you don't have ways of punching through escalation firewalls into high levels, including the level of nuclear war. So So in this environment, the goal is to manage capability in an intended environment to avoid insecurity dilemmas. I'm going to show you a little graphic which came up last year in Singapore and then was elaborated through a series of discussions, and there's a paper forthcoming. So it sort of shows you a set of insecurity dilemmas. Here, treaty relationships with the U.S. and Western countries do pretty well, and conflict relationships in the red, and assistance relations in the green. And the major insecurity loop is the U.S., Russia, China loop, and these actors have been going at each other for quite a while. It's mostly secret, it's mostly in espionage space, but some of it's coming to the surface more at this time. And then other loops react to it. So we have the NATO-Russia situation with Ukraine as one dynamic, and then we have Northeast Asia as Japan, South Korea worry about increasing Chinese capabilities. There's a Central Asia loop that neither the Russians or the Chinese will talk much about, but they're struggling for power and influence there. And the One Belt, One Road comes along with a bunch of fiber communication and also data centers, but the data centers are located back in Japan, in China conveniently. Let's not get confused. And then we have the South Asia one with India, Pakistan, and China in the loop. And then we have the Middle East one with Sunnis and Arabs bashing each other, and Israel and NATO getting in the loop. So mostly this is your structure, and the big power loops tend to drive these secondary loops in terms of capability, so it's hard to solve the secondary loops problem without dealing with the major loop problem, and there may be feedback into the major loops. There's also an Oceania, Singapore and Australia also have their own issues, primarily with China. So these are linked and makes these dilemmas worse, makes it harder to address them. We have some ideas how to do it in a dyadic case, but when they're linked, it's a bigger challenge. So, what can you do? And let's just point briefly at, what is the new capability we're talking about? It's mostly espionage that, they find out the other guy's been spying on them, they get sour, they try to develop their own capability, and some degree of actual disruption in some cases, but we really haven't seen a lot of that. So this is what you can do about this situation to reduce risk. Number one, you can do state restraint. So we have a lot of activity in that area on CBMs, cyber norms. International law is your friend to help stabilize it, and then specific cooperative risk reduction measures. The insecurity dilemmas is a new argument for why you want to do state restraint. State restraint is inexpensive. A lot of it's already there, the international law. You just have to adhere to it. And so, we pointed this out to the Chinese last year, and they're busy thinking about what it does for them because they sit in the middle of Asia. And they have not just the U.S.-China relationship to worry about, but they have the Russians they don't talk about, and then all the regional ones hang around them. So their problem is really, how do I manage all of this when I sit in the middle? And I think if you look at their nuclear strategy of only launch on second strike, that's actually, that passive approach is actually a pretty good way to attenuate these dilemmas. Your other option is cybersecurity and resilience. This takes a lot of work, it's expensive, you have a lot of vulnerability, you have a lot of poorly designed ICT, which wasn't meant for security, and this is the way to go in the long run, and this amounts to deterrence by denial. And then you have deterrence, so you're going to punish the adversary. So you need declaratory policies and attribution and tailored responses. There's a lot of discussion in the U.S. about how to make deterrence, in this case compellence, work against the Russians to get them to stop doing the influence operations against the elections. And I'm not sure that all the thinking is being talked about publicly, but the State Department has put out some discussions on cyber deterrence. In any case, when deterrence goes wrong, you may end up with a war. So that's a fairly dangerous option. Security and resilience is no problem. You fix your own systems and make it harder for the adversary. And then state restraint is the least expensive, and you can probably make it happen pretty quickly if you can convince everybody. So my view on arms control for cyber is this. The objective is to forego offensive opportunities in order to increase cyber stability. And for me, that translates as a technical guy with a pretty deep understanding of information, computer security, network security, is to raise the level of information assurance to reduce cyber vulnerabilities. So the idea is raise the level of security across the entire globalized technology plane to remove sets of offensive opportunities, take out lesser actors that don't have the resources to play in that game, and then narrow the field down to the big actors that you can then concern yourself with. But just for completeness, there's another component which I think is controlling proliferation of cyber capabilities. So this is a more immediate. And in this context, we're going to talk about controlling the supply chains for cyber munitions. So there's companies that supply the states, whether it's the US, China, or Russia. Preventing the use of certs for development of offensive cyber tools. The UNGG had a norm about this, and basically when you talk to a developing country, they want a cert, and the eyes go wide about all the capability they're going to get when they get that malware and reverse engineering. So everyone wants a cert so they can get some offensive capability. So there's an issue. Then, of course, there's constraining black markets for crimeware. This gives scale to the criminal element. And you need to work that if you want to keep the criminals under control and keep them more or less at bay. But at the same time, these black markets are proliferation vectors for states that want to move up in cyber capability. And then finally, there's avoiding leakage of cyber capabilities through responsible operations. So when you use sophisticated malware against the other guy, he can reverse engineer it and use it again, or it can proliferate, so there can be a problem there. So the structural security dilemmas are the situation in which the marginal cost of offense is lower than the marginal cost of defense. So that pushes everybody onto sort of an offensive approach, and defense really doesn't work, and so you're going to get a lot of effort on deterrence. And you're going to get preemption strategies preferred when it's a use it or lose it situation. Everyone wants to have asymmetric sort of warfare capabilities, which makes it a problem in the case of conventional encounter, certainly with big powers or lesser powers. You also have short decision cycles, pre-delegated authorities, maybe algorithmic triggers. So all of this makes for instability in this sort of forward defense or early defense concept. And that gives you a danger of crisis instability, increases risk of catalytic escalation. So what you want to do is stabilize the international security systems by introducing technology change to move the balance from offense to defense. So the International Vulnerabilities Equities Process idea is that, we said that we don't have enough security in our ICT systems, and that gives us multi-level cyber conflict, which I'm not really explaining here, but it's basically kind of whole of country predation at any level, steal the R&D, steal the economic trade secrets and technology, get into the operational technologies and critical infrastructures, apply it in the military sphere, apply it in the intelligence sphere, the criminality layer. Then there's the political layer above it, including influence operations, and then there's an ideational level higher up that you get out of the interconnectivity and communications. That's what that is. So we get military and cyber instability and fragmentation for global markets for digital products, as we don't trust the other guy's ICT because it could be Trojanized or inadequate in various ways. Although localization is not a security architecture, but it is a surveillance architecture. So our goal is to create floors for minimum security across global information communication systems and services, and through this International Vulnerabilities Equity Process. And the idea of that is that it should identify vulnerabilities and architectural flaws, and then enable us to eliminate these in a rapid fashion. So rapid patching, and then motivate policies to correct architectural flaws. Some of the architectural flaws include the lack of memory safety in modern commercial architectures today. If you have that, you eliminate 80% of the vectors for cyber hacking. So the buffer overflows and the type errors that allow you to run the first function doesn't go away. And this problem was solved about 1972 in software with safe programming languages and 74 in type-safe hardware. So our idea then is going to be to use WTO to drive information assurance over the longer term, and we'll talk about some shorter term ones. All right, so we'll go through a few of these proliferation issues, and then we'll turn back to the international equities process. So the norm here is all producers of cyber munitions should be licensed and regulated, so you can control the sale and the export. So at least don't have it leaking out too fast from the suppliers. So we do have private sector offensive tool vendors that you want to have them licensed and not randomly selling to unapproved entities. At the same time, you want to make sure that the security on those firms is high enough so actors aren't stealing all of their exploits. And you want to pursue unlicensed producers as criminals. Might be a little bit of a challenge where the criminal element is used to generate technology, for example, in Russia. And then you can extend supply chain controls internationally. So I think that the best idea is to do this around the P5 plus some, in that they have more capability. So getting them to restrain the exports of those capabilities would probably be useful. And maybe the WASNR could do something in a broader context. I think it needs to be thought through precisely what the incentives are. How do you share with allies? How do you keep it from going to irresponsible states? So the black markets for cybercrime should be prioritized because it's a key scaling factor. So the norm is law enforcement should emphasize disrupting black markets for cybercrime tools, techniques, procedure, data, and expertise. That's pretty straightforward. Then we want to avoid the leakage of cyber capabilities, so states should evaluate the gain through cyber operations against the potential for leakage, reverse engineering, proliferation. So you may want to design your tools. So, for example, they're encrypted, and they only decrypt when the pattern matches over the target, makes it harder to proliferate, or maybe you don't use it. And then we see some bad consequences, and want to cry and not petcha of when these techniques get out in the wild. Additionally, if we look at the Iranian case, having been on the receiving end of Stuxnet, then they woke up and got the idea about cyber capabilities, and they wanted some of those. So they beavered away, and now they're busy hacking the Sunni, and the Sunni are hacking them back. So even the demonstrations can be a problem, and you want to take these into account when you're considering operations. Further consideration is in light of the insecurity dilemmas, you don't want to scare the other state more than you have to. So you want to be careful of that, because if you scare him too much, then he's going to redouble his efforts to generate capabilities, and you won't be happy in the next iteration. Then with respect to the certs, states should not use computer emergency response teams to acquire and develop offensive tools. Everybody wants to do it. So it seems that the best idea would be to exclude these countries that are found to be violating this norm from data sharing, cooperative analysis, and mitigation. So if you use it for offense and we find out, then you're going to be in a worse position on defense. You're not going to get the timely sharing of malware and signatures, things to resist, and you're also going to have a harder time doing analysis. That could be a pretty important incentive to stay away from the offense side of this. So now we're back to the raising the information assurance level. So the norm is to raise the assurance level and make defense better, i.e. deterrence by denial. So arms control really is foregoing offensive capabilities, and arms control can shift the balance in favor of defense. So the problem with self-restraint is asymmetric. Capabilities are opaque.
Cyber weapons are hard to define. Inspection and verification is unlikely. Enforcement is impractical. Law-following states are penalized, whereas the law-ignoring states are, go right ahead. And cyber offense is eroding traditional political military stability. So this is the, why the traditional approach really doesn't work. In this case, enhancing security and resilience for both military and civilian systems cuts across the board, makes it harder to do operations against them, raising of supply chain integrity, also assures that those systems are solider. So if we think about two militaries that are ingesting ICT that's vulnerable, then in, say, a momentum-driven conflict situation, they really may feel they need to use it before they lose capability. Whereas if they have more confidence in the security and resilience of those systems and the integrity of their supply chains, then they don't have to move as fast. They can allow more time for policymakers to think through the situation. So the benefits of this approach are it's verifiable and enforceable. It's really self-enforcing because you propagate the technology everywhere. And you have a monotonic path of raising the cost of malicious actors as you raise assurance. And so the slogan is secure computation enforces cyber arms control. So if we put this into the matrix that the Defense Science Board used in their 2013 report, we're really working here on the vulnerability quadrant to increase assurance, achieve deterrence by denial, and promote architectural change to eliminate classes of vulnerabilities. So when you have these architectural flaws, you don't get one vulnerability, you get a whole class of them, and mostly we spend time trying to fix the specific instances, but the architecture keeps generating more. So if you fix the architecture, you have a multiplicative impact on the vulnerabilities in the wild. So you're essentially climbing hierarchy and doing logarithmic work to achieve multiplicative impact, so it changes the combinatorics of your strategy. Then on the consequences side, we're looking at increasing resilience because that'll help us get more stability. So if we look at the multipliers of ICT production, we have an IT capital goods industry, which I call the critical infrastructure, which provides sort of the componentry that's really spread around everywhere. So there's hardware, operating systems, software tools, crypto, and public key encryption. And we have hosts, networks, data stores, cloud, tool chains. So these are created, and when these have vulnerabilities, then it's passed down into the consumers. So it goes into critical infrastructures, government and national security systems, enterprise frameworks, enterprise computing, consumer computing. So the problem we're working on here is the feedback up to the system. At the present time, there's really no limitations on these companies. They have no liability, and so therefore the business models are based on transferring risk downstream without penalty, and these business models are maintained by intensive lobbying. So nobody changes that. If the lobbying went away and you had a class action suit against them in the United States, class action lawyers tell me that if there was science from 50 years ago that you failed to implement, you shouldn't bother to hire any lawyers because you'll lose. If you had email, let's say 2-3 years ahead of time and didn't do anything, you could hire lawyers and then lose after 5 years. So you have an industry in that situation, and at the same time, you have the Chinese awake, and with a national goal of becoming comprehensive, developing comprehensive national cyber power, pushing lots of champions. On Tuesday, I was at their Internet Security 2018 conference in Beijing, which is kind of the RSA of China, with 30,000 people there charging after this problem. So what we want to do with the International Vulnerabilities Equity concept is to work this feedback loop and affect the production of the ICT capital goods sector, raise the level of assurance there, and propagate it downwards. If you think of it as a tree, When these guys generate up here, at each step down, it's a multiplier, so it branches down. So it's really creating exponential vulnerability as you march through all these new domains and apply things everywhere, and Internet of Things, and on to the night satellites. So if your problem is an exponential problem, you need a multiplier that will allow you to get after it. So we want to use the same multipliers as they're using. So we know what the target is. So a strategy for international security and resilience is to raise awareness and then deploy international policy levers necessary to influence this industrial sector. And by the way, the global sales of ICT products and services are about $4 trillion per year. So it's a big beast. And people talk about norms and regimes. It's a very thin veneer that's trying to control this really big beast with a lot of action. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but essentially, we really covered it. You need to deal with the stakeholders. One of the things to point out is that you don't want to just pull liability and kill the sector. So what you want is phased improvement. So they can actually learn to do better rather than killing the sector. These are some of the things you can do. There would be high leverage security moves. So we know about separation kernels in operating systems. So they keep the programs that are running separated. These could be put in everywhere. Huawei's put it into their router. Trusted boot from hardware and firmware and OSs and runtime checking. Some of that's already in place, but there are no hardware resets to clean up the firmware. So entities like the State Department, after being hacked by the Russians, couldn't afford to buy all new equipment, so they're permanently hacked because can't clean up the firmware. Hardware bounds and type checking, we mentioned memory safety, that's a high leverage move. Safe programming languages, another one. Hardware read-write control, reset for firmware, deals with a State Department problem. And mostly you want to have minimal complexity hosts. You want it simple so you can understand the attack surfaces. Mostly you had very complex systems, not designed for security, with all kinds of attack surfaces, so much so that nobody can even count them. If you can't count them, you can have no chance of defending against them and no chance of actually doing security metrics. In order to do security metrics, you actually have to know what the attack surfaces are and be able to characterize the attack-defense balance both statically and dynamically on the attack surface. So I'm not going to go through too many more of these. This talks some more about the equities process. In terms of an approach, we really want to go after the high-risk architectural features first, prioritize those, and then try to see what industry can fix in a quick way. So you want to enable rapid patching of critical vulnerabilities. The faster you can patch it, the faster you disrupt adversary attack life cycles. They have to go back and do some R&D on their new approach. And longer term, we want to get these architectural fixes. I'll point out that the architectural point's not lost on the Chinese. On Tuesday they had a senior academician talking about internet security, and on the chart is architectural change. So they have that idea, they'll be working on it, so everyone else should be working on it too. So who does it? Well, reporting should be done by governments, industry, and academia, and we want to feed them in and then get action on them. Technical experts will do the security analyses, and then we need to incentivize, so that's industry, governments, international organizations can do that. What are the options? So you can do distributed, you can do coordinated approaches, you can do group options, and we'll see some more. You can have membership groups, for example. Maybe big finance is going to do their own idea on how they raise security and insurance for systemic risk in the financial sector. Mostly it's the private sector that implements, probably with the exception of China, which has a lot of SOEs. They're going to work in this area. Tsinghua University would be one of their SOEs. So what are the limits? So targets are critical vulnerabilities and broad spectrum ones exploited by cybercrime or lesser actors. They want to look for key enablers for cyber arsenals of other states. So if you don't like somebody else, you can report the vulnerabilities he's using. So you can imagine actually a defensive arms race here where you out the other guy's tools and techniques, and as you do that, you raise the difficulty of doing these attacks. So what are the precedents? The United States has had a vulnerability equities process since at least 2008. It probably had one earlier, but it was classified. 2008, Melissa Hathaway published some material on how the government thinks about what offensive, or what vulnerabilities to keep for offense versus which ones to retire due to defensive concerns. It was revised in 2014 under the Obama administration, and then again in 2017 by Rob Joyce before they got rid of the cyber advisor position. No more need for that. No adult supervision is needed.
Yeah.
And so the idea is to drive phase increases in information assurance and to reduce drag on GDP from malicious cyber activity. In this situation, we have the Information Technology Agreement, which is a zero tariff technology trade agreement from about 1996, where there's a duty-free movement of IT products across core countries involved in that. It's basically OSC. I'm getting confused.
OSC.
No, it's OECD.
OECD.
Exactly. And so again, phased implementation, focusing on architectural leverage, and then negotiating a bit with industry and so forth, and then building momentum on global standards for information assurance, our resilience. So one thing that if you move in this direction, you're going to have higher assurance products, and that's going to reduce the insecurity that countries will feel about buying your product. And so to the extent that they can actually check it themselves and convince themselves that it's safe, it will work against the fragmentation of the IT sector. The IT sector was something like 13% of world trade in 2008. I'm sure it's more now, and was a poster child for free trade. So essentially, the security problem is going to undermine that, so to the extent that we can make progress, we'll be able to maintain that globalized structures, although there are other issues that are coming up now that will maybe work the other way. So what can you do in terms of policy levers to incentivize better information assurance? So what you can do in a country, you can name and shame. You can do indirect incentives like the NIST Cybersecurity framework, where everyone wants to know if you're implementing it, and if you're not, then they wonder why you're not, and your stock goes down. Insurance markets are another idea people talk to a lot, but the insurance companies actually need to be able to have actuarial tables or criteria for what their risk is. And if you can't give measures of security and you can't compare those against the capabilities of threat, you're in a bad way in trying to really price that risk. And so you're going to only do parts of the market to contain your risk. Tax policy, I think, is a good area that nobody's really worked that much. So credits for security R&D, credits for improving the defenses of your companies is good. Accelerated depreciation rates is really good, because what you want to do is turn over the installed base for new higher security products. And indeed, if you can run the upgrade and security faster than the attackers can upgrade their attacks, you might be able to stay a bit ahead with some time lags there. Legal responsibility is an important component. You can take civil actions to motivate actors, and maybe criminal actions and egregious negligence. Nobody's gone to jail yet for egregious negligence. There are examples. The favorite example of Felix Lindner, who's a white hat hacker in Germany, is a company that wires the administrator password into their product and cannot change it. And then the product is all over the planet. Millions of versions of this, and then the administrator password gets onto the internet, and there's nothing you can do. So you may pick something like this that you want to set an example around, that really, if they are that dumb, they really shouldn't be in charge of those decisions. There's always direct regulation. I think the French and the Chinese, could approach this. In the U.S., it's sort of a hard sell, and yet key critical infrastructures are regulated, and nobody seems to remember that point. So when you get serious, you can start regulating them. I'll observe that in the case of telecom in the United States, the government told AT&T they wanted a system hardened for nuclear war, and then AT&T wanted to know who should pay, and they were told just charge it to the rate base. So that's what they did, and years later it was found out, and people complained that they weren't represented in that taxation, but that's something you can do. And in fact, it's a cost of doing business, and it's a level of protection. You can argue about whether a company needs to defend against state actors, or that's the job of the state to do that defense. But at the end of the day, the society is going to lose if it's not undertaken by someone. And finally, we have trade incentives that you could block trade in substandard products. You could have penalties for cybersecurity pollution. So if you think about electrical appliances, we have standards for those, and you can't import the product, but when you plug it into the wall, it burns the house down. Right? So here, we don't have any standard for, you plug it into your network, and all your IP is exfiltrated. There's nothing to deal with that, so that's sort of a little bit out of step. So international mechanisms, we have vendor unilateral action. So Intel, Microsoft, Apple send in the vulnerability and they fix it. Microsoft's done a fair bit of this. Intel is still struggling on the side channel attacks and Spectre and whatever the other one is. And then we have Meltdown, right? Yeah. And then we have industry standards for products and services. So the sector does something. So the trusted computing model, the TPM, which is already in the processors, is an example of that. So you could do that. You could do voluntary accords for sectors. I mentioned the Basel Accord, but maybe it's a smaller group that does that. And then there's a notion of an international cyber stability board, which has been talked about by Frank Kramer and Bob Butler and Catherine Lotrionti around the U.S. and there's considerable interest, also in the UK and also to NATO. So you could have a board like this to sort of help do things. You have the technology norms, so NIST cybersecurity framework, so we do it for more sectors. Kind of national regulation based on standards. The nuclear reactor sector is very interesting because this is a critical infrastructure that took on board information assurance standards by 1970 and integrated it with security and safety for the reactors, and then carries it forward to now. So it's a sector that's way ahead of the other critical infrastructures, and there's probably something to be learned there. We can have policies of supranational entities and alliances, EU, NATO, for example, on critical infrastructure. They've been somehow magically came up with a bureaucratic arrangement to work the critical infrastructure security problem. I think mostly in the power area. So that's ongoing. And then we have a WTO, could do something with the information technology agreement and digital trade agenda. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this. So if we look at WTO, there's a lot of action on the digital trade agenda. What do we do? How do we handle all these e-services that are growing? Digital commerce penetration of some of the Asian countries is maybe 8% or so. In the U.S. about 6%. Chinese or something like that. I think Koreans are leading the pack, but the numbers have probably changed. And yet all of this e-commerce is based on this vulnerable technology plane. Is that what you want to bet your economy on? So if you have information assurance objectives in the for WTO, the goal would be to have reasonable security, product labeling, incentives that the companies will respond to, some kind of enforcement story, a technical evolution, and then some way to handle cross-sector issues. Processes would really build from an information assurance working group, because that's how they do it in WTO. You have a working group, and then it does things, and you agree to implement what the working group comes up with. And we'll talk more about that. And you want an architectural vulnerabilities equity process. So as you line up these architectural problems, you decide which ones you want to fix first. You can fix first, and kind of work through those. You're going to need some interoperable standards. You have to identify feasibility sequencing. You need a dispute resolution mechanism, some monitoring of the effectiveness of what you're doing, and then some ideas about how you can get feedback and then refinement on your approach. So standards are the key problem here. And let me say one thing. The WTO has never been used really to restrict trade. Okay, I'm almost done. It's never been used to restrict trade, but this is a trade restriction activity. Moreover, it doesn't really have experience in this area. So it's going to have to reach out to somebody else. And so it's going to have to use standards that it gets from other standards bodies. And these standards are going to need to have some legitimacy if we're going to get a lot of countries to sign up to them. So chances are that we're going to need to have standards that the U.S., EU, and the Chinese can agree on. That's probably a good start. I'm not going to drive to, but there's a lot more to that. So there's a standards problem, and then there are a lot of different layers, and you got to feed that in. And you're not going to do everybody must implement a specific approach. That's never going to work. You're going to have sort of a range of them, from transparency measures, just labeling the product for, well, what is it that you use? What kind of operating system do you have? What are the features that you have? How good's your crypto? So labeling. Another one would be sort of technical standards of what kind of system to use, if not the specific one, but the class, and then operational standards of how do you operate these, how do you configure them, how do you do supply chain. I'm going to skip that. Go through this one a little bit. So you need to know what problem you're solving, and you could have a technical norm. These are the kinds of things you want to achieve, but I'm not going to tell you exactly how. I might give you some hints. If you have a recommendation, this is really what you should do. So it describes an approach. And you might have public comments and recommendations that you adhere to it. You might have an actual hard technical standard that says you really need to implement this capability. And then you might also deprecate the norm, recommendation, or standard as you develop a better idea. This pattern more or less follows IETF standards life cycle. You'll need a whole certification and accreditation ecosystem that has this kind of transnational character to operate this. The trade group will have to sort of go through this kind of cycle of analysis, selecting the correct norms, recommendations, or standards, commenting, implementing, monitoring how it's working, maybe enforcing, assessing the impact, and then adapting. So we're not going to go into this too much, but you can get a lot of benefits out of this kind of approach, but you're not going to do it right away. This is a 10-year project, if you're lucky. If everybody agrees, it's a 10-year project. Interestingly, in discussions with the U.S. TR folks, they're not against an approach like this. So they could see something like this as part of the digital agenda, and they think it'd actually be a good thing for WTO to do, even if it's a long-term project to get there. So just quick conclusions. So we talked about the controlling proliferation of cyber capabilities with 4 norms, to control supply chains, prevent the use of certs for offense, constrain black markets, and avoid leakage. And then in this technology layer, argued that foregoing offensive opportunities is an approach to increase cyber stability. That means raising the information assurance to reduce cyber vulnerabilities. And we need a general solution if we want to shape information assurance in globalized ICT markets. Single countries can do something, and maybe others will react, and you can have some impact, or single companies will do something, but there's a lot of ICT to affect, and so this kind of globalized solution would really work well. I mean, ideally, we could turn it into a defensive cyber arms race, outing the other guy's exploits, building higher assurance products, and then if we can move down that path, then we'll get higher stability in terms of these military issues that we mentioned, and we'll deal with reduce the insecurity dilemma. So it's a way to approach that. And I think I'll I'll just stop right there.
Okay, John, well, thank you very much. That was a masterly overview of a very complex set of issues. And it's almost hard to know where to begin, really. I don't think I'm going to try. So we've got about 15 minutes, just over, for comments and questions. Could I ask you, please, when you do raise something, to identify yourself and your affiliation, if any? Good.
Lynn Evans. I'm Senior Advisor to a number of companies, including in cyberspace. This is fascinating because it is so vociferous when you're trying to reassemble it. But if I could make one practical suggestion, 10-year timescale, absolutely. Have you thought of bringing in the ISO, International Standards Organization?
I think they would be part of it for sure.
Sorry?
They would be part of it. That's a key standard.
Because if they work together with the WTO, assuming the President doesn't withdraw the United States from the WTO, as he keeps on threatening to do, or not appointing judges and so on. If you did it as a JV between ISO and the WTO, ISO, first of all, develops technical standards for very complex issues, including nuclear submarines, chemical laboratories, whatever. They have a pattern of assembling working groups, which are both governmental and companies. If they're self-selecting, so you tend to get the people who really do know what they're doing. And the WTO could provide the institutional, governmental aspect, and you might have a potential framework there. US tends not to like the ISO because they think, US have their own standards, and who is anybody else to tell us? But it could be a model that you could examine. And they've done some pretty unusual ones. Inter alia, one on private security, which ran the full range from human rights to everything to do with firearms, which they were unused to. But the work was essentially funded by the US government, by the Pentagon in particular. So if they are funded by someone to put together such a group, they have quite a lot of experience. And from that, you then get the whole process of certification and accreditation that goes with it.
I think that's a great idea. I should have it in there. I kind of had it in mind, but maybe not on the slide. I think that you're going to have the national approaches. So just EU, US, and China. Nobody's going to buy into any single one of those, probably. Even if the Cubans did use NIST standards and some of their stuff, which is sort of interesting. But if you could sort of integrate across them, push it through the ISO, you're going to get a lot of buy-in. And I know that the Russians are also involved in ISO standards. And the Chinese have respect for it. They brought up the ISO folks to talk standards. And they have a big standards operation. So that means that's a key issue of having the legitimacy on the standards and a process put in place. But I think we have to have also softer standards. I don't think we can go necessarily to hard standards on everything. And we may have kind of the softer standards of sort of norms and suggestions as you start moving forward.
You're going to need a suite.
Yeah, and an iterative deepening in certain areas where you decide it's critical.
Okay, gentleman at the far end.
Tom King. I'm a member of this institute and associated with LSE Ideas and the Royal United Services Institute. John, that's a fascinating talk. And what I would find interesting is if you could describe the world that we would be in if all of your ideas were to come to fruition over a 10-year period. It sounded to me as though it was a world in which, yes, there was much greater resilience against criminal attacks, perhaps against attacks by terrorist organizations, by states with less developed cyber capabilities, but a world in which there remained a group of players at the top who would have the capability to attack others. And apart from wondering how that would improve relations between that small group at the top, I also wonder how this could be sold to all of the other countries lower down this food chain.
So I guess one of the first things to consider here is it's all a mistake. So there was an article written by Carger and Shell, 2001, which was a retrospective on Multics, famous classical secure operating system, in where many of the modern security features were implemented. And as they go through their discussion, they say not even Multics is fit to put on the internet, and what we put on the internet is vastly weaker. So the idea of doing higher assurance systems is for sure the right issue, right approach. Problem is that you have a lot of commitment to vulnerability and insecurity due to mistakes that industry has made. And essentially when we got started on this in the early 90s, you couldn't put security first. It's too expensive just to get the access going. We basically followed that path. In terms of raising the security, you'll be in a better situation. But I think what we need to consider is that all our societies are going to be completely digitized, so full dependence on these kinds of technologies. And you can't afford to have the ability to reach in anywhere and do whatever you want. And we can see with malicious actors, they're busy developing business models and con-ops on how to cause societal effects. So you got to make that a lot harder. So I think everybody's going to want to have more security. That'll make them feel good. Like with nuclear weapons, they may not like the big powers having capabilities that are retained. Normally when we talk about the stratification of cyber powers, I think it's in the DSP report, but I talk about a multi-spectrum actor. So a multi-spectrum actor can hack you. He can run insiders. He can do supply chain attacks to corrupt the gear before you get it. And then he can break your crypto, or he can get side channel leakages, and he can blend those all together. So the 2013 Defense Science Board says you can't defend yourself against a Tier 6 actor. And basically we think that the US, Russia are the Tier 6 actors, and that China's working really hard and probably already there. Nonetheless, it doesn't mean you should just give up, because we think that there's over 140 countries developing cyber offensive capabilities, according to General Shostuya, who one of the senior SIGINT thought leaders from Russia, and nobody has any idea on what they're going to do about 140 countries bashing each other, and what that will mean in terms of disorder. Because when you ask anyone, they all come back and talk about Russia, China, and the U.S. So they're having enough problem with big actors, not thinking about the rest. So essentially you're going to get more and more friction, you're going to get leakage to cybercrime, there'll be more drag on the banks, a lot more drag. So to the extent that we can make progress on this kind of approach and just make it harder and kind of corner the problem, break it down, we're going to do better. And I think the countries that don't understand this, are going to make ideological decisions on whatever their preferences are. So it really won't matter. It's like the UNGGE, basically. It's a political show for the guys that are unable to do the analysis themselves that gets a buy-in to whatever your big power position happens to be. We don't really see a developing country perspective, maybe with the exception of the Indians. The Indians may actually, come forward with, some leadership on what you need to do there. And even for them, if you think about the Indian case, you've got hundreds of millions of people coming online, numbers of maybe billions, that are not really functionally literate and running their bank account on their cell phone, and actually they need secure products, or it could be devastating for them. If you look at India, they've got biometrics for the whole country. They have a lot of ICT. They want to use ICT to develop. And so I think they'd be very happy to have higher assurance ICT.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. Sorry, Tom, it's not that I didn't recognise you. I can't see you against the light from here. Yes.
So, Stephen, I'm head of technology risk at Credit Suisse Bank and fellow Kings. First of all, thank you. I mean, the depth of your background on this is only matched by the density of your slides. My question is to push back slightly, or to ask you on the sort of assertion about the significant advantage of offense over defense that you're almost taking as a given here, technically. And I wonder whether, against the background where I think certainly the National Cybersecurity Centre figures are that 80-90% of the attacks are actually not using kind of complex, deep state, zero-day attacks. They're using things that everybody really should be able to counter. And if you put aside the kind of deep state espionage and focus on effects and covert action, that side of the equation, critical national infrastructure, once you begin to get people understanding, taking it more seriously, investing more, once you begin to get things like in the UK, where you're essentially just trying to make the UK a tougher target than France. But raising up to things like the government passing to British Telecom lots of things which they then give for free to all homes, and sort of raising the cybersecurity there. You get to the point where for those really high-end things it's use it and then lose it. But more broadly, those kind of disruptive efforts become trickier. And I wonder whether you speak as if that shift isn't going to happen. But I just wonder whether actually it might happen, it might take the same amount of time as your international norms.
So this is an incomplete talk. And so you have a number of good points there. So my understanding is that 90% of the cyber attacks are using a human vector. And of course, a human vector may be exploiting an architectural problem. So if you want to count clicking on a link, a human vector, then it's an architectural problem because that just shouldn't happen. So we can cut some of that out. Then we have the problem of the business model and the business process. And so one of my friends says, I don't care how good your security is, it could be perfect, but the business process is so broken it won't matter. So actually, and this doesn't have it in here for reasons that we're trying to promote this as a broad spectrum international approach, is that you need to design the business process together with the IT that you bind to it, version it. So if there's a problem in the business process, it can be exploited, say, by social engineering or some other kind of flaw, or there's an IT problem in that binding, then I can go patch it, fix it, and then update others who might be sharing it. So you could think of component business processes. So I think that's an important way forward. I think that'd be good for the banking sector because they have a lot of shared sort of activities that they do, and a limited number of wizards. So that's a way to get scale. So I think that's certainly true. I think another component that I didn't talk about is the issue of algorithmic warfare. So I was on a panel on Tuesday, and the head of the think tank at the National Technical Defense University, rolled out a little question for me. Well, what about the U.S. DoD's efforts to develop algorithmic warfare that morning? And so I don't know anything about that. However, I think that that's definitely in the cards. So if you're using AI systems in different ways, or you have some kind of e-commerce systems or other kinds of algorithms that you put into your systems, these can be used against you and they can be attacked. So there's something to bear in mind, and here we didn't say anything about how to handle that. So it's even in, whatever you want to call that, so the IT for industrial organization, let's call it that. We'll call it algorithmic economics. So there's a need to pay attention to that and to understand its resilience properties and security properties. Case in point could be cyber systemic risk. So we take systemic risk in the financial sector, and then we think, well, of those components, what are the IT footprints of those? And what are we doing about it? If attacks on those systems or disruptions could then trigger systemic risk in this higher system. So presumably that's sort of a core structure we want to understand, and we want to architect for it in the way we design the operations of those companies. And that would include a stratification story. So we figure out what's core to the business, to the risk that we're trying to defend against, and we invest more highly there and maybe less on more marginal activities which won't cause such impacts. And I guess the final thing to think about is we're having a hard time with this issue in peacetime. So think about crisis and wartime. I mean, how much of this would stand up in wartime? And how would you be architected to be able to operate in those environments? I think in the U.S., we've seen finally some action after the DSB study on cyber resilience in 2013. So the Pentagon's got an office on cyber resilience. People are worrying about this problem, trying to figure out how to do it in a military context. That's probably a good place to work it. And then as you develop concepts and how to organize, you can push it out into critical infrastructure and key civilian sectors. I think you can be sure the Chinese are busy thinking about this problem. There's a lot of attention at PLA on how to do asymmetric warfare, then they apply it to themselves, how do I defend against it. So it's going to drive these kinds of loops.
Okay, one more question. I think this will have to be the last. Yeah.
Michael Burke, Royal College of Defence Studies. Thank you for a brilliant and brisk talk. Apologies if I missed it, but I didn't see an aspect of the plan which I thought I wanted to test with you, which is that nations signing up to do this and raise global information assurance standards for good offensive cyber reasons would be buying into a day-to-day reduction in traditional foreign domestic intelligence that they receive. Now that need to be ventilated to what the US process seeks to achieve for a nation state. But at the international level, do you see that disrupting any of the incentives you hope would flow to support the rising tide?
I don't know. I think we have to think it through. I mean, I got started on this in December in Korea, where they invited me to a conference on the right internet, which is this concept of improving the internet, cleaning it up, making it a safe place, including security and resilience and so forth. So I think there's an appetite around various countries to do better. I think the vulnerabilities equity process that the U.S. does, anybody can do that. And they don't have to disclose whatever it is they're going to use for offense. They can just disclose the stuff that they think is important for their defense. But if you have a broader range of countries that are engaged in that activity, you're probably going to hit more of the vulnerabilities. And I think there's also an issue of the pipeline. How do you, if countries are going to do this, where do they publish the result? How do I channel that into somebody who can take action? So basically, it's got to go to industry if somebody's going to do it. So how do I get it to the vendor? How do I get the industry sector working the problem, or into any of these other venues? So I think that needs to be thought through fairly clearly. You probably want to, it's not just the WTO is sort of a long-term version, and obviously I think we need to do all the incrementals along the way, and maybe ones that are easier to do and sort of decompose can operate in parallel, and then you can gang them together.
Okay, thank you very much, John. I'm sorry we're going to have to wrap this up. I've got a feeling we could probably carry on for a couple of hours, but unfortunately people who allow us access to these rooms have the deciding vote. So, John, thank you very much indeed for coming here, and thanks for a very insightful and very comprehensive presentation. Please join me in thanking